Lesson 14, the thought efficiency on controlling the spirit, a real-world story, the psychological war. In this real story, we will recognize the great benefit that the believer gains from the thought, that precious gift which the Almighty God has favored the human with, then how the psychological war gives affecting rules and gives its fruitiness. Lack of commitment leads to failure of the revolution. Officer Muhammad Amin Sheikho seemed to be totally preoccupied with an extremely weighty matter. His features were clad by serious, deep contemplation, while a look of intense truthfulness and firm determination could be seen in his eyes. His spirit was always fully absorbed in finding the way to express a flood of great compassion and kindness, so a few lines had appeared as furrows on his wide, pale brow, indicating the breadth of vision associated with his lofty intentions that paid no heed to the passage of time and its many events. Equally, they denote the lines of the future inscribed on the pages of history. Hovering close by was a soldier waiting to speak to the officer, but he hesitated to disturb him. He, too, appeared to have a pressing problem on his mind and stood there sighing from time to time. Eventually, he approached his commandant, speaking, "Sir, please, I want leave of absence." Muhammad Amin snapped out of his reverie. "What? Leave of absence?" He thought. He could not believe his ears. "You're asking for leave as we're about to set off on a mission? Are you crazy? Get away from me." The soldier left, wrapped in his own thoughts once again, but it must be said that this soldier was extremely fond of his commanding officer, interested him implicitly. Implicitly, he saw in him all the characteristics of bravery, manhood, and humanity, so he turned his horse once again towards him and said, "Please, sir, I beg you to let me go now, and I will join you tomorrow. I know the area where you will pitch camp. It is at the end of Damascus Oasis, it is," and he began to describe the exact location to his commandant. Then he continued, "So I promise you, sir, upon my honor, that I will keep my word." "What are you saying? How can you ask for leave at this time? Does it mean that you are a coward and afraid to die? If I agree to your request, it will be as if I'm giving you permission to stay away from danger, to be safe from dying, and if this gets to the ears of the high command, they will charge me with treason, and then we'll both be sentenced to death. Sir, I'm appealing to your leniency and call for your kindness and compassion. Let me go. My wife is now suffering the pains of childbirth, and her delivery is usually difficult. And as you know, sir, I am a foreigner in this country and have no family or friends here, so there is nobody to help her except me." "Soldier, I've told you, go away. Under the circumstances, no one could possibly agree to such a request." The soldier turned away, overcome with sadness, but before long he turned back towards his officer yet again, his source of refuge and support. But before he reached him, an idea had flashed into the mind of our officer, Muhammad Amin, who was so overcome with happiness at finding a solution that an immense feeling of gratitude towards God seemed to shine from his eyes. So, as the soldier approached him again, he winked at him to put him at ease, and then both of them spurred their horses and walked side by side away from the path of the column of scouts and military personnel, so as to be away from prying eyes. "I've thought about your problem," our officer said to the soldier, "and I really sympathize with you. I can feel how anxious and confused you are, so I've decided to give you an extended leave of absence. Go to your wife, because I'm sure she needs some help, and perhaps her condition is dangerous for both her and the child, and do not return to duty until I send for you. But you in turn must do something for me." Eager to comply with his officer's wishes, the soldier said, "You have only to ask, sir, whatever you want, and you will find me at your service. In a little while we will reach the location which will be our base from where we'll conduct exploratory forays. You know the area well, so I want you to," and he began to explain an idea he had in his mind while the soldier listened attentively. When our officer finished talking, the soldier asked, "But sir, you haven't told me what you want me to do." "I'll tell you when I send for you." The soldier thought that he wanted him to carry out a personal favor, so our officer left him with this false supposition and ordered him to rejoin his platoon. The soldier spurred his horse and trotted away happily, his eyes filled with tears of joy. Our officer, Muhammad Amin, was deputy commander of the French Advanced Reconnaissance Division, but if the High Command had not been doubtful of his loyalty, they would have assigned him as its commander. They were fully aware of his military genius and abilities that astounded them and caused them to admire him greatly. But, however, they could not forget that he was the officer in charge of the Anjar Castle when the greatest arms deal between France and Greater Syria had taken place. These armaments had been stored in the castle, and one night they were seized by the revolutionaries. The French could not be sure about his real role in that incident, so they appointed him as an adjutant rather than the commander. The French government decided that it could no longer tolerate the revolutionary skirmishes against its force, which kept them constantly on the alert. Therefore, they mounted this exploratory expedition of 3,000 heavily armed soldiers, planning to exterminate all of the rebels once their locations and numbers had been established. All members of the public came to know about this expedition. General air of gloominess and anxiety pervaded throughout society. Then the leaders of the revolution hurried as usual to their refuge, the Arab officer Muhammad Amin Sheikho. How often they had reverted to him seeking his protection and found him indeed their strongest and safest sanctuary. How often had he endangered himself for their sake. And yet every time they went back on their word and let him face his fate alone. Only Providence stood by him and saved him in the nick of time, so that potential failure turned into unique success. But at this particular time, destruction and death were hovering above them, so they promised him faithfully and swore by God to measure up favorably in the judgment of their Lord and his, so he did not disappoint them. If God guides me to an appropriate solution, I will certainly use it, but I am not the commander of this expedition, and the possibilities may be limited, so put all your trust in God. The commanding officer of the Reconnaissance Expedition looked at his adjutant in a way and conveyed both trust and admiration. He knew of his expertise and wisdom and of his superb abilities for planning, which led him to seek his advice on all military matters and pin his faith on his genius. So he gave no order without first asking his adjutant's advice. Therefore, when he saw that our officer had left the column to walk alongside a particular soldier, he became concerned. Yet it was not long until he saw him coming back towards him. Then, an expression of sadness on his face, our officer spoke to him in a loud voice so as to let other soldiers hear. I'm very surprised and feel rather anxious. I moved away from the column to explore the area and to question the herders so as to assess the best approach for the coming fight. I've been told that the rebels have come together from everywhere, from Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Halma 25, and Al Arab Mountain 26, and they are all marching towards Damascus 27. They have called up a lot of supporters, numbering some 10,000 so far, and it's growing all the time. So the information that the government has is true and not just rumor. Indeed, I cannot understand how they have sent us on this mission with such a small army. As a ruling power, fighting against a gang of revolutionaries should be that we make a show of force and have 3 times as many men as they have in order not to lose face. Haven't you noticed that the High Command has not sent even one Frenchman with us? Now talk is useless. We're obliged to fight and win. In fact, it's obvious that this expedition is not for reconnaissance as it's supposed to be, but is for us to engage in combat. On hearing these words from his trusted adjutant, the commandant's face turned pale, and he was wide-eyed with shock. The news circulated among the ranks as rapidly as fire spreads through the dry stalks of a wheat field, and fear begins to creep into their hearts. The expedition continued marching until they reached the designated location. There the soldiers hurried to set up camp. They pitched the commandant's tent next to that of his adjutant after leaving a wide passage between them that divided the camp into 2 parts. Then they put the arms in the middle, standing on end and leaning one against the other, creating pyramid-like shapes so that the rifles could be quickly and easily accessed by the men. When our officer entered his tent, the commandant hurried in behind him and asked, "What shall we do now? What is the fighting plan?" "I'm tired now. In fact, I feel exhausted, so I want to sleep for a couple hours at least, and then we can make plans. We are going to face a tough fight, and we won't be able to sleep tonight as the rebels are close." The commandant asked him in amazement, "Can you really sleep in such dangerous circumstances?" "Yes, why not?" our officer replied, and lay down on his camp bed and closed his eyes. The commandant looked at him, his eyes wide with surprise, and then left the tent. He stood outside, completely bemused, brought out a bottle of wine and drank it to the last drop, and tossed the empty bottle away in frustration. He began to ply the area outside Muhammad Amin's tent, which made our officer feel a certain optimism. Clearly he had no intention of sleeping, but wanted to test the commandant's reaction. In the meantime, the soldier rode his horse slowly away from the camp and headed towards the hill behind which the camp was raised and rode to the top. Then he quickly turned his horse and spurred it onto a gallop at full speed down the hill towards the camp. The dust swirled, and the horse neighed loudly. Then the sound of its thundering hoofs soon came to the ears of all the troops and their commander, and they sensed there must be danger in the air. They all stood motionless and stared at the rapidly approaching rider, who was waving his arms in the air, his face and eyes filled with dread. He was shouting, but his words could not be understood. As he passed through the passage between the tents of the commander and the adjutant, his thunderous voice could be clearly heard, and his terrible words fell on every ear. "We'll be slayed, Arabs, we'll be slayed, Arabs, we'll be slayed." The wilds seemed to echo the desperation in his voice while he just kept on galloping, caring for nothing else. The expedition leader looked startled, and his eyes popped out, clearly showing the effects of the wine he had drunk. He looked towards our officer, the man of the moment. He rushed out of his tent and mounted his horse, loosened the reins, and let it race away. The soldiers turned their eyes towards the commandant and stared at him to see how he might react, but since he had been overcome by dismay and wine in equal measure, he could think of nothing but saving his own skin. So he ran towards his horse, and mounting it, he spurred it into headlong flight. Silence and deadly alarm prevailed over the soldiers who stood there, their eyes wide with fear and terror. What should they do? Since the commandant and his adjutant had both fled, what could the soldiers do except turn tail and retreat? Suddenly turmoil spread among them so that they seemed like a flock of sheep running away from the attack of a lion. The entire force, soldiers and officers, fled, caring for nothing but their own safety. Indeed, the soldier who had requested leave of absence had now performed his part perfectly. He had been motivated by the vivid mental picture of his wife in labor. In his concern that she might have difficulty while giving birth with no one to help her, afraid that if he did not go to her, he might lose her forever. Now let's turn back to Officer Sheka, who continued to spur his horse to go even faster and little by little began to pull away from the line of the fleeing troops until he was sure that they could not see him. Then he turned his horse back, heading once again towards the camp. When he reached there, he rode about the camp and found nothing but complete quiet and empty tents. He looked up the dividing passage and saw the guns thrown to the ground in complete disarray. The cowardly troops had left everything behind and saw nothing but their own safety. He dismounted his horse and set about looking for the field telephone. When he found it, he cranked its handle a few turns and then asked to be put through to the high command. There and then, all other calls were interrupted and cut off, for calls from the front always had priority. Within moments, the interpreter was on the other end, translating every word to the French army commander, who said to the officer eagerly, "Tell me, what is this news from you?" "It is very bad," our officer replied. "We're having a hard time. There are more than 10,000 rebels coming at us from every direction, and the number is increasing all the time, as if they're pouring out of the land. So we have fallen back in order to avoid the rebels outflanking us, so we can get out of this difficult position with minimal loss." "How can you be there talking to me?" the French commander asked. "I have a racehorse." And immediately our officer cut the wire with a sharp knife that he had ready for this purpose, leaving the interpreter yelling "hello, hello" at the end of the dead line. When the defeated troops reached Damascus, every one of them told a story about the event, his horror and fear inspired by his own imagination. So they spoke about unbearable events filled with unbelievable violence, and besides, the majority of those men did not report back to their barracks, for they were sure that the occupying French would soon be driven out of the country by the assault of the revolutionaries, so they preferred to escape than be killed. This news was like a death blow for the French, for the high command thought that a great number of troops had been killed in the battle that actually did not take place. So when General Sorel, the French resident in Syria, looked into the reports and information which he received, he was shocked and overwhelmed with bitterness. He found himself in a desperate situation that filled him with terror, for he believed that in just one battle most of his troops had been killed, while the revolutionaries were advancing in large numbers towards Damascus, bent on victory. This was a summary of the reports coming to him. Therefore, he believed that every opening had been closed to him and felt as though day had turned into night. He had not yet forgotten how the revolutionaries had attacked Anjar Castle and seized the weaponry and ammunition stored there, which France had shipped to its army in Syria. At that moment, he turned to his general staff and burst out in a bitter and desperate cry, "Pull out, pull out!" All the French forces and their commanders withdrew to Lebanon and left everything behind: the barracks, the arsenals, the munitions, the bases, the mounted cannons with their balls at the crossroads, and guns scattered here and there. They were happy to run away, even in Beirut. General Sorel did not feel safe. He feared that the forces of the resistance would reach there to weaken French power and destroy them. Therefore, he preferred to make use of one of the warships which patrolled the Mediterranean Sea and to wait on board to watch the culmination of that horrible event. Thus Syria remained free of its occupiers and enemies for 3 full days and nights, waiting for honest Syrian men to seize the opportunity that Officer Sheka had presented to them. It was a suitable moment for them to make the first move in order to shrug off the mantle of shame and eliminate injustice. But alas, slaves are not shackled by their chains, but rather by their own subservience. Their dubious intentions soon become clear, and their lack of conscience obvious to everybody. Is that not what you asked for? Is that not what you wanted him to do? Muhammad Amin accepted to go to fight alone with the support of his lord, so after this distinct victory, you had only to enter the empty barracks, take up the dust-covered ordnance, and take over the country. Instead of that, the revolutionaries headed for the stores and set about plundering them and killing each other, and one of the dishonest leaders of the revolution was killed while he was robbing a storekeeper in Al-Zuria market at gunpoint. For 3 full days and nights, every camp remained empty, with no one present to offer any resistance, but even so, not a single positive idea passed between the leaders of the revolution, who surely had failed to rise to the cause. In the meantime, the agents who were in the pay of the French were following the situation and informed them that no one had entered their camps or touched their heavy armaments on the rebels' behalf, and that the whole affair had been nothing more than a dense black cloud that had passed without becoming a storm. When General Sorel received the news, he returned to Syria with his army and vented his anger on Damascus. He did not hesitate to show the depths of his inhumanity and previously concealed bitterness and anger. He gave orders for the heavy artillery to shell the Ad-Midan quarter, which was known as the refuge of the insurgents. So the houses were destroyed and the flames rose high into the sky, while rivers of blood flowed, depriving children of their parents and parents of their children, reflecting a picture of the most draconian barbarity.